Hey everyone, this is Foxhunt, and this is, I guess, what is the Complextro tutorial to end all Complextro tutorials. A lot of people have asked me to do another one of these, so I thought, you know what, I'll go all in and just make the biggest fucking video I could possibly make. So, like the other video, this is going to be less of a track from scratch and more a deep dive into the production techniques going behind the genre, etc. So first off, I'm going to talk about the genre itself. So the word Complextro comes from the words complex and electro. So this genre itself is kind of the staple of the genre is quick, rapid sound design changes and mainly syncopation with the beat. So it's essentially 128 BPM disco with heavy bass sound design. And there are a couple of different styles, and each of the main, like, I guess, big Complextro producers has their own individual style, and I'm going to be covering 3 of them in this video. So we have got the Wolfgang Gartner style, dark, moody, like gothic Complextro. We've got the Madian kind of uplifting, big super saw, chord stacks and all that jazz. Then we've got the Virtual Riot style Complextro, which is more about the sound design and growl basses and such. So I'm going to be doing this tutorial inside FL Studio, but it doesn't really matter what software you're using because I'm mainly going to be covering techniques and not how to use the DAW of choice. So when you start off making a track, you've got a blank project file. Where do you go first? So for me, I normally start off with the drums because in this genre, it's often like your sample choice, the beat you make first, it kind of determines what you're going to do with the rest of the track, and that can be really helpful because it means you can like get yourself a style sorted immediately and just build upon that. So Complextro, being a 4/4 genre, often has the kind of basic kick, snare, drum beat. Obviously you can add some flair to it. I'm going to go through the 3 different types I mentioned earlier in sample choice. So starting off, we have got the Wolfgang Gartner style Complextro, dark and moody. So this generally has more understated drums. They're not really kind of big EDM style drums. They're often a lot shorter, a lot snappier. So if I go through some of the samples I've got here, so for example, the kick drum, I'm using this X for Records kick here, which sounds like this. At least it does when there's a filter on it. If I put it here, you can hear the low end a bit better. So that's what I'm using for my kick drum. And that's obviously just playing a hit, 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 hit pattern. And for this kind of style, there are a lot of good packs. I mean, Wolfgang Gartner's got his own pack, so he's got a lot of good drum one-shots for this kind of thing. Also, I'd recommend getting Vengeance Electro House. They've got some pretty good kick drums and such for this style. So if I go back into the playlist, you can see how I've got my kick and my snare. I'll just solo these out and turn off that reactor there. So to kind of keep the intro less aggressive, I've kind of filtered out the low end here. And then I bring it back in about halfway into the intro just to kind of keep the energy going. And yeah, this snare is a clap and snare kind of layered together to make this kind of sound. You should pretty much always find a good clap and a snare to layer on. Some packs have it already set up for you, which is useful. So next I added a couple of percussion elements here. That reactor is really going to start annoying us. So these little odd percussion elements, which are just kind of add a bit of variation to a pretty simple drum pattern. So I got those from deadmau5's Exfa pack, which is available on, I think you just go to the Exfa website. I'm not sure it's on Splice or anything like that. So coming back to this, if you listen to it all together, we have got this. And then, so halfway through, I'm going to add a little more variation. So I've got my hi-hats, which are, once again, kind of short and snappy, not very overstated. And I got these from the Black Octopus Leviathan pack, which has got some really good drum loops and hats. And in fact, there is a drum loop I use here, which is a good loop. Play this all together and you get this. Okay, so the Madion style ones, you can go a little bit bigger with the drum choices. So this one's kind of a thicker kick drum. And once again, you need to layer your clap and snare. And there's some good packs for kind of French Complextro. Rods has done a pack here, and I'll go through some of these sounds. So there's some good kick drums in here. Once again, it's just kick, clap, and adding kind of drum loops as you go along, which I've kind of got here. The drums don't really evolve as much in this one. And you can definitely sample snares from other places in a French kind of Complextro. I know the French are all about that sampling, so I just straight up nicked a snare from Madion and used it as a kind of like a interlude going on here. I didn't really do many other rhythmic elements in this track because I don't think it needed them. I think it worked well as it was with all these fucking sounds in the drop. So onto the drums for a kind of more aggressive Virtual Riot style Complextro. With this, you can go a lot bigger with your drums because you're going to have some more complex bass design and such. So the kick drum I used in this one was once again from Rod's drums. It was this kick drum here. And the snare was from that as well. But obviously another good one for that would be Black Octopus Leviathan. They've got some really kind of big, thick kick drums. And once again, it's just about, you know, that kick snare pattern. With this though, I went a lot more, you know, complex with the kind of drum loops and such. So I added this one. Which pulled together sounds like this. It does not sound like that. That is the basses. And then of course, from that, once again, you've got your hi-hats. Which I used a Wolfgang Gartner loop for these hi-hats. So together that sounds like this. I didn't really go for many extra percussive elements in this track, but I did have this one down here, which kind of sounds like... which I just kind of put on the very edge of the first kind of bar here, and it just adds a little variation to the drums. And if you add the bass to this, it really works well together. This little drum hit here just adds a little variation here. Because in this variation of it, you had this one extra bass sound, and with this hit, it kind of calls forward to that extra bass hit. So, moving on to the drop in the Wolfgang Gartner project. This style of Complextro doesn't really make advantage of really kind of deep, complex sound design. It's often very basic. So the structure for this one generally is you have the big kind of chord impact at the start, which is this section here. And that's just kind of creates a big impact at the start of your drop, just to that's the wow moment, I guess, and really kind of helps to kick off the drop. But then you've got the added challenge of keeping the energy going, and that is down to the rhythmic elements, not really the sound design, but more about how you place the sounds. So you've got to make sure all your basses interact with your drums in a rhythmic way that makes sense and keeps the flow of the track going. So from the big impact, you've got this little bit here. And if you were to like move these things around, so for example, if I just grab this serum here and change up this, if I took out that tiny little dot, it'd sound a lot less continuous. Just adding that extra little blip really does help, and that's the kind of philosophy you need to kind of take on when designing a drop like this. So going back into sound design, there is one sound which is always going to be your go-to, and that is the square saw. And that is easily made. You just get a square wave and a saw wave. So that just makes this sound. And you just play around the positioning of these oscillators. So I normally have the square set to -2 and the saw set to -1. And that gives that kind of sound. And that is just going to be the basis of Complextro. This sound is, because you've got the beefy low end of the square, but you've also got the really kind of crisp high end of the saw. And obviously you can put that through all sorts of distortion. You can change the voicing options. So also adding a little bit of white noise to this kind of makes it a little bit brighter, which is always good. Put that through some distortion. And then from there, you can obviously send it to a mixer track, apply any kind of, compression, post-processing, etc. And that is how I got the main sound of this track, actually. So if I bring up this serum instance here, you can see it is just the square saw. That's going through some distortion, compression, dimension expanding, etc. And also, this plugin is more useful than you would think. This plugin really does help. It's just you've got to use it properly. This isn't a instant, okay, this is a mixed track. This is a compressor and a saturator. So essentially what you're doing is you're putting your sound through a multiband compressor, which is kicking the bass all the way up, kicking the high all the way up, and just kind of squishing it really. And it really does help to bring the most out of some basses. But going back into the drop, we have got more additional elements other than the basses. So we've got the arpeggio here, which is just adding a little bit of background rhythm. And then, of course, at the bottom here, we have got the ambience. I'm going to move on to the ambience in a bit, but I really want to talk about the chord stack in this. So the easy way to get the quote-unquote Foxhunt chord stack is just to take your chord. Say you've got, this one is a D minor, and you add this second note in the harmonic series. And this creates a really dissonant sound. So you go from this, I'm just going to solo this harpsichord, to this. And that's how you get the kind of creepy, dissonant chord stacks. So I've layered the harpsichord with, of course, a super saw here, and the super saw is also going to be a good staple backbone to these tracks. So this is just these two layered together. And then, of course, you've got the bass, which layers underneath that, which goes like... Put them all together. And that section there, that 4 bars, is pretty much the entire drop. It's just slight variations on that. Complextro is a very iterative genre. It's very progressive, and a lot of people don't really get that. They just kind of make the drop different throughout the whole way, which can be cool, but like it doesn't keep a kind of flow going. It doesn't call back to earlier elements, which is kind of the staple of the genre. And this is something I've done with the sound design in this one as well. So the sound design in this all stemmed from this sound in the intro here, which is this and I just took that sound and duplicated it loads of times and made changes. So most of the sounds in this track, most of the sounds in the drop, came from that one bass stack. So this one, all of it. So going back to sound design a little bit, there are a lot of techniques you can use to kind of get your basses sounding nice and growly and thick. So obviously there's subtractive synthesis, which is what you've got for most of this track, which is just taking 2 complex waveforms, putting them through a filter and some effects. But of course, FM synthesis helps out a lot. And that is what I did for this one. And I'm not going to go too much into the basic principles of synthesis in this video. There are a lot of tutorials in this, but I'm just going to talk about some of the techniques and, you know, what kind of sounds they achieve. So FM is how you're going to get your kind of weird, crazy, growly sounds. It's good for kind of like one-shots and things like that. I wouldn't make it the main bass a lot of the time. You don't have to make all the sounds in a track. I fucking don't, because like if a sound already exists that I want to use, why would I bother going through the effort to remake it again? Like, preset surfing can often inspire a lot of work, and that is one thing that it's mainly the bass community which is so against using presets, and I don't know why. Yeah, it can be unoriginal. Yeah, you can hear sounds that other people have used, but if you're using those sounds in a unique way, then it doesn't really matter that much. So the background elements I used in this one, all these kind of vocal weird things. So I'll solo them out so you can hear them all. There's a lot of them. And these are like... I really do need to turn off that reactor. And what these background noises do is they're always there kind of in the back of the track, but you don't really notice them as much. They're just kind of chilling. And this, combined with the sidechain, really keeps the energy of the track going. So if I play the track here... And now if I play it without all these kind of background elements, it sounds a lot more empty. It sounds a lot kind of more basic. So what that does, it just kind of helps fill in the background of the track, like any frequencies that are missing from the bass are all being filled up by this kind of slight background ambience, and combined with a sidechain, it keeps the rhythm going. So the structure of the drop in this one, like I said earlier, is it's very iterative. So you basically got the same thing. It's these 4 bars with variation. So the second version, like the plays, there's a few extra little differences here and there, but these 8 bars, they don't change throughout the entire drop, apart from these, like this B section I've got going on here. And the way you keep it interesting is you keep adding different elements. So you start out here with just the bass, then I add a lead, which comes in here. And you can do that. You can just have these two sections and keep on building on these. But with this track, I wanted to change it up a little more. So I added this B section, which is actually kind of a more stripped down version of the drop, which comes in here. And this is something you can, like, you don't have to do this. You can keep this bit going. It's all personal choice, but, you know, I'm here to tell you what I've done, and you can take from this tutorial what you want. It's not you have to do this. It's just guidelines and things. So it's just one way to keep a drop interesting is to kind of strip it back and then bring in more elements later on. But, you can easily just go with this. If I had like a less bombastic intro, I could have had a really minimal kind of first part of the drop, then added the hi-hats, then added the lead, and then gone to this section. It doesn't really matter what order you do things in. So with the drop in this one, I went through a lot of kind of audio files, and this is another way you can kind of arrange it. So you could create a synth line and then just cut it up and drop it around in places, which is useful because it kind of makes you think in a different way. So this is kind of what I've done with a drop in this one. So again, it's all about, you know, just repeating the same section, just building on it. So you've got this 4-bar loop here. And that is the drop up until this B section over here. And you make it interesting by adding things. So here I add some hi-hats. Here I add the lead. And then you kind of bring in this riser over here, which is in this B section. And this B section just kind of helps to just change it up a little bit, because this kind of really small loop will get boring if you just repeat it. So it helps to break things up a little bit. So sound design in this one was pretty much the same as what it was in the other one, like the drop bass here. I think this one's from Silent, yeah. So this is, once again, it's a square saw. So you've got here, which is at -2, except this one I am, it's made from 2 parts. Silent is a good synth because you get 2 engines, basically. So here I've got 2 squares, one at -1 octave, one at -2 octave, and then the saw at -2 octave, which kind of makes it a little bit more low-end focus, not as crispy in the high end. So that gives you this kind of sound. Once again, this is going through some Soundgardizer processing, some EQ, just to give it a bit more high end there, and then sidechain, which is something I haven't talked about yet, and that is how you're going to get this pumping effect. And basically what sidechain does is it's a, well, depending on the way you do it, it is a compressor which brings down the volume of all your instruments when the kick drum happens, or it's a repeating envelope on the volume of your sound, which is synchronized to the beat of your song. So there's a couple of ways of doing sidechain. I tend to use plugins like Kickstart. So What this does is it essentially runs all the time, and this is the shape that the sound follows. So if I play this, you can see the sound getting squished here. Now, you could do it this way, or you could set up like a limiter and link it to the input volume of the kick drum. But with that, the sidechain is only ever going to happen when your kick drum happens, whereas with this, it's always happening until you turn it off. And the good thing with something like Kickstart is you can synchronize it to MIDI input as well. So if you're doing something other than 4/4, you can trigger it whenever you want, basically. And another good plugin is LFO Tool, which is something that I use as well. And that is essentially the same as Kickstart, except you can draw in this envelope. You can pick which happens here, which is useful for tracks where you're doing the sidechain and you think, it's still not heavy enough. Well, how can I get it heavier? Well, you can just draw it in yourself, and it's really helpful to do that. So some of the sounds I used in this one alongside that square saw were just like little odd one-shots like this one here, which I think is massive. I ended up using this on Ghostlight at some point as well, when I can actually get into my goddamn channel rack. I don't normally work with one monitor. This is new to me. So this is a track I took from Ghostlight, which was a very old track, but it's a good sound, and it's this kind of like almost vocal kind of growl. And I just use that as a one-shot every now and then you got sounds like that wobble and things like that. You barely even notice that wobble when it's in there. And once again, it's just keeping a kind of rhythm going, because if you break up this rhythm, the track is going to sound very disjointed. And that's where a lot of Complextro producers definitely go wrong, is just by having sound after sound after sound, but not working out where those sounds should go and in relation to the beat of the track. So the drop in this one makes use of a lot more complex kind of sound design. So if I just play these sounds, so there's a lot of FM going on here. There's some vocoding. So if I take this kind of bass, which sounds like a fucking angry skeleton, that is getting fed into this vocoder. So putting basses through a vocoder really makes them a lot more squelchy and gets that kind of, puts them, I guess, in like a virtual space, I guess, because it's trying to mimic what it would sound like coming from a human mouth. And you can get some really interesting sounds just by running your shit through a vocoder. It really does accentuate some of the frequencies. So along with that, we've got this kind of yoy bass here. And that's just going, once again, through a big old sound goodizer. And put together, it sounds like this. So once again, this is just following the principle of taking your loop, your bass loop here, repeating it and building upon it. So in this one, you notice I don't actually have any chords, and that's because this one bass here, that's acting as the big impact for the drop, because the breakdown here isn't as like bombastic and overstated as it is in some of the other tracks. So it kind of works well just having this one bass as your main impact sound. Because alongside that bass, you've got, where is it? I got this one sound. This one here. So that adds the variation the second time it comes around. And once again, it's the same kind of bass loop, this one. Once again, just being repeated with slight variations. So in this second section, I add this lead. And that's just a big super saw made in Silent with a lot of compression and such on it. So one thing I haven't really talked about in the other parts is the dissonance in the drop. And that's these kind of like one-shot sounds and such. And for those, I normally just use like random one-shots and like distort them, slow them down, speed them up, etc. And another way you can do that kind of thing is just by recording in like you messing going around, like going ham on the front panel on a synthesizer and just recording a long session and taking bits of it and just putting them in places. And these just kind of like, I'm trying to think of a way to word it. It's like plays with the subconscious, I guess, because it sounds right, but it sounds wrong at the same time. Like, I guess bass music in general as a genre kind of really does play on nasty sounds that sound nice. So again, in this one, I've got a background element, which is this this guitar melody here. Let me find it in my sample library, actually, so you can hear it without all the effects on it. Melody. New disco. Where is it? This one. And what I did is I just pitched that down and threw a load of reverb on it, and that created this. And there are a lot of ways you can do that. Like you can do it with vocal samples and such as well, just throwing loads of reverb on it and then just sidechaining it. So once again, just keep the energy going throughout the drop. So another way to keep a track interesting is to have a different drop on the B side. So that's how I kind of padded out the track length of this one. So the drop in the A side goes like this. Whereas in the B side, it goes into a different pattern here. So one of the things that does is, especially if you're going something bigger with your second drop, it makes the second half of the track have more impact than the first, which can be really useful, like just to keep the track interesting mainly. So instead of like building up from a point here like I did in the first drop, I kind of went down instead. So start off with like this big bass chain here, this one. And then built it down and went back to the original kind of. And especially if you're not really doing anything major with the outro, that can help because you can take your drop and strip elements away until you're just left with essentially what was going to be the intro here. And you take things away slowly until you're left with just like the bare minimum stuff, which is good for an outro. So the breakdown in this one is the melody is from Moonlight Sonata, which is a Beethoven piece of music, I think. Don't quote me on that. And it's something I like to do is I like to take like classical melodies and incorporate them into big electronic music. It just creates a nice kind of divide. So that's something I use like in the drop here. So I talked earlier about taking elements of the drop and using them in the intro. That's something you can do the other way around as well. So here I've got this arpeggio, which is playing Moonlight Sonata. And I use it in the drop here, which once again helps to tie the drop with the breakdown here. So this one doesn't really have a big build or anything like that. It just goes from into the drop kind of quickly. And that is why I don't really have this big impact here, because if I had a bigger, longer build, I don't think this drop would have really worked. So moving on from your drop, you're going to have a breakdown, and some tracks you don't really need to have a breakdown. I know in my track Lycanthropy, I just didn't ever really stop the track. It was constant. And you can do that, but you'd need to still find a way to mellow it out. Otherwise, it's having constant sounds on your ears is going to get kind of grating. So what I did in that track is I kind of had a section where everything got filtered out and just brought the lead in. But in this track, I've got more of a traditional breakdown. So going to the chord structure in the Madion track, you can see it doesn't follow the minor kind of structure with the added second note in the harmonic structure. In this one, I use more seventh chords. So you've got your, I think this is in F sharp minor. So you go. And that just comes from this pluck, which is, yep, it's a preset, which is, once again, totally fine for what you want to do. Like, this track started out from this preset and me messing around with chords. So once again, they inspire creativity. Obviously, you should know how to do sound design, because that way, if you want a sound and you don't have a preset for it, you can make that sound. Or if you've got something that's close to that sound, you can modify the preset. So this is just building up with these chords and this lead, and that builds into the drop. So I'll just play a bit of this. So for the build-up in this one, I kind of just took elements of the drop and repeated them and filtered them in, just to kind of bridge the very different breakdown with the drop. Although, once again, the breakdown should always kind of convey the theme of the song. So with this one, it's these kind of lush chords and minor sevenths and such. So the breakdown in this track, I did something completely different to what was going on elsewhere in the track. So I actually took some harpsichords and made this kind of Bach medieval kind of breakdown here. So with the breakdown, you do need to keep the kind of tone of the rest of the track. So the way I did that in this one is I reused this lead line from the drop. So this lead line plays later on in the drop, and this is like the... And I took that, put it in a harpsichord, and then just created some chords and bass notes which went along with that, and just built it up as the breakdown progressed. So the chords in this, I didn't really do any sound design. It's obviously all real instruments. So you can do that, and it works a lot of the time. So good libraries for real instruments. A good free one is Labs from Spitfire, which is this thing. So you can get this for free, and it's got some really interesting playing styles, which you wouldn't really find in the other libraries. So I know a lot of people use session strings, but you wouldn't really get this kind of play style, which is a tremolo, but it's kind of a bit more interesting. And there's this horn here, which is a really interesting one. Sound design for this one was kind of simple, because you've got your, where's that bass actually? This one available in one of my preset packs if you want to purchase that. Kind of like a recreation of the bass from Il America. And that's kind of like a big kind of vocal bass. And I did that just by having a low pass here with the resonance turned all the way up there. Now, did I put it through a bandpass? Yeah, I did. And that's just distortion again. And that works as kind of like an underlying bass here, because it's kind of minimal what else is going on. So I didn't really want a minimal bass. I wanted something which had a lot of presence here. And making arpeggios is really easy, especially if you're using a plugin like Cthulhu, which is a generative kind of MIDI plugin. If I grab that and stick it on a mixer channel over here. This is a plugin that I highly recommend. It's very good. So what you can do with this is you can input notes and like load up a different arpeggio setting, and it'll arpeggiate the notes to this setting, and you can like draw in this. And if you're stuck for ideas of how to make an arpeggio and such, you can just literally play notes in, and this will generate arpeggios for you. It's really cool. A lot of people ask how to get the kind of like, oh, what plugins do you use to get a really analog kind of sound? And what I do is I don't use plugins, I use analog gear. And it's a choice to get gear. Like, it's very fun to use, but it's very expensive and not something I'd recommend if you're just starting out, to be honest. But the quality of the sounds and like the ease of use of something like an actual physical piece of hardware is miles above what you can get with a VST, because everything's there on the front panel. Like, you can be experimenting with dials while you're making the sound more than one at once, whereas in something like Serum, you're just like clicking one dial at a time. But you can emulate the sound by using the right plugins and such. So one good one that I use is a plugin inside Reactor called Monarch, which is a recreation of the Moog Model D. Let me load that up. So yeah, this is a good plugin for kind of analog sounds. And this is in Complete. I think it's like in the cheapest version of Complete, actually. You can get this one. Otherwise, it's like £89 or something. And don't get me wrong, you can get really good free software as well. I use a lot of free software, like that Labs thing I showed off in the Wolfgang Gartner style track. That is entirely free. Synth One, which is a good synth, is entirely free. You can get DAWs that are entirely free as well. So you don't need to spend money to get started on this stuff. So the intro for this one was the intro for Complextro in general, especially if you're doing this kind of Wolfgang Gartner style, is kind of easy. You just take the drop and strip it down. That's all you need to do. So I've got this bit of the drop here. Which is basically just this, but, you know, more aggressive. So the way you would do something like this is you could just take bits of the drop. You just literally paste the drop here, strip the drums out. The way I've like made it less aggressive here is by giving the bass like an LFO, making it not a constant sound, and also taking some of the lows out as well here. So this is what this high pass is doing, which creates more of an impact when you bring them back in here. So the intro for this one, instead of having like the drum intro, which a lot of Complextro tracks do have, I basically just took the breakdown and made it more minimal. So here it's just these chords here. And I just build that up across here. Which I then bring into the breakdown, which is this section. So one of the perks of doing this is if you're just listening to the track, you don't get that 1 minute of what is essentially just the same beat, which is very useful for DJs. Like, if you're a DJ, having a drum intro is really useful just because it really helps to bridge one track from another. But as a listener, it can be pretty boring if you're not really doing it right, like just having drums, not really doing anything with it. So doing it this way really does kind of grab the listener immediately with something. So I talked a little bit earlier about bridging the breakdown and the drop, and you do that with build-ups and such, and you don't have to do like a big build-up. It doesn't need to be something as big as this track, but it's good to have because that way it's not jarring when it happens, and you can do that with like risers and things like this. And what I've done here is I've flanged the actual sounds of the drop as I bring it in. And now we've got the filters which bring out all the bass, which really helps when the bass hits in the drop. You've got this section without any bass, and that makes the impact of the drop a lot more, you know, impressive when it comes in. So the intro for this one is I actually started on the intro for this one rather than starting on the drop, which is something that I normally do. And that is just this kind of marching bass sound here. And I use that like this. Like it's essentially a drum intro, but instead of just drums, I've got a bass line going on over the top of it, which keeps it interesting for the listener, but still at the same time makes it easy for DJs to use it while you know, mixing a set and such. And I kind of glued this together by just reusing elements from the drop. So like the little arpeggio here in the background is playing the first chord in the track. And then I reuse the intro here in the drop just with that lead line over the top. And I also use like the intro as the outro as well. It's just doing it in reverse essentially. You take the intro, and as it builds up, you copy and paste that and just take parts away from it instead. So in here, I've got like the hi-hat loop going on here, and then I take that away, just bringing it down to the bass, just... And it just kind of keeps everything cohesive. So mixing in electronic music is a weird one because you're basically mixing as you go, and that's something that you should definitely be doing because it makes it easier, like at the end, to just finalize everything. So while you're going along, make sure you're adding your EQs and things like that to your sounds and making sure nothing's clashing. So on your basses, you want to be cutting out the lows so your sub bass come through, etc. Like you should also pay attention to the stereo field a lot as well, because if you're going to have everything mono, it's all going to be fighting for the same space. So a general tip I know a lot of sound engineers talk about is cut instead of boost. So if you want more high end in a sound, you can cut out the low end. Essentially, it essentially is the same thing. Obviously, when doing sound design, it's a lot more difficult to just cut things away because anyways, then you're just going to end up with a tiny fucking sound, which is not what you're after. But when mixing at the end, it's generally a good tip to do. So mastering wise, it's obviously not something I'm amazing at. It's not my strongest point, but generally this is the kind of master chain you'd get along with something like an EQ here, which is cutting out the frequencies which you can't hear, but they still exist. It's just we can't hear them. So they're still taking up space in the mix, but they're inaudible, so you don't really need them. From there, I go into an exciter, which basically adds a distortion to the signal in different bands. So you can add distortion to the lows, the mids, the highs, and the like super high frequencies here. And it really helps to add like a bunch of crisp to the high end. So something I do is I kind of have this setting. Obviously, it's all dependent on which track you're working with, and it's all like down to what suits the track you're working with. So if you've already got like a really bright high end, you wouldn't really want to add this extra bit of distortion coming in here. And obviously you can change the mix amount and the amount here. Then I'd bring it into the imager. So in music, you want your sub bass to be mono, because if you're going to have your track played out in a club, you're only going to have like the subwoofer signal is going to be in mono. So if your sub is really wide, they're not going to fucking hear anything because that's all coming out of this one mono speaker. So generally you want the sub to be mono. And from this, I'd go into Maximus, and this is a multiband compressor and maximizer. So what this would do is you can set which bands you've got here and where they are, and then you can compress them all differently. So if you think the bass is a little bit too overstated, you can bring that back in line with this. And if you want more highs, you can, bring them up a little bit. And it's up to you if you want to put a limiter on the end. I generally don't, because I feel like it just squishes the tracks a little bit too much. If you've got like good mixing and mastering, you won't really need a limiter at the end. So that just about covers everything. If you want to support me for, giving you a fucking whole hour of tutorial, you can grab my latest album, which is available on my Bandcamp, or you could grab some of my many preset packs, which are linked below. And thank you for watching.